the G7 host Japan is facing several economic pressures, from declines in both wages and consumer confidence to the ultra-loose monetary policy. Chris Gilbert explains.
Nobuyuki Kamata says he's had to shed a third of the staff at his vintage clothing store over the last few years as the pandemic kept customers away. For many retailers in Japan, it's been a fight to stay open. But now that COVID curbs have been lifted and shoppers are flocking back, Kamata is slowly beginning to rebuild.
We learned a lot from the experience of dealing with COVID. We learned how to strengthen our business and adapt to change. This allowed us to survive, and our staff became stronger.
Kamata stayed afloat by reaching out to new brokers and finding new ways to secure affordable stock. And now he's finally seeing some improvement in his books. But for many businesses, the waiting game is taking too long. Consumer spending unexpectedly fell in March at the fastest rate in a year. Persistent inflation is hitting people hard in the wallet, and many businesses are struggling to cope with surging operating costs. Saki Aoyagi is the owner of another clothing retailer who's been cutting back where she can.
Small business owners like us are self-employed, so if the economy goes down due to the weak yen, our salary does not increase. Meanwhile, our personal food and electricity expenses have gone up. To cut costs, we've started to cut back on groceries and use of the air conditioner.
Aggressive rate hikes in the US, coupled with the Bank of Japan's ultra-loose monetary policy, continues to weaken the yen, pushing up import costs and prices. For months, Japanese people have been waiting for a much-anticipated rebound from the pandemic to spur wage growth, but inflation-adjusted wages have been falling for a year, dropping by nearly 3% in March on the same period a year ago. Japan's central bank is maintaining a hands-off policy, saying it wants wages to increase naturally over time.
But we see some big movement in Japan. We see some inflation that we have not seen over the decades. So there's still have some chance to see those changes in wage-setting behavior. But the main scenario is that we don't see that drastic change in wage-setting behavior.
The silver lining: economists believe that when wages finally do begin to go up, it will have a snowball effect, propelling further pay rises in the future. If and when that happens may rely on the private sector, as companies balance retaining staff with the soaring cost of business. Chris Gilbert for CGTN, Tokyo.
For all things G7, James Moore joins us. He's the founder and CEO of the Washington Institute for Business and Government and Society. Welcome and good to see you. You know, if you take away the Ukraine issue and you take away some of the issues with China, the world is a pretty good place. But we can't ignore those two things in the world we live in today. The G7 is taking place among a backdrop of very serious geopolitical issues. Let's start with Ukraine. They're obviously talking about it. What do you think the game plan is from the G7's perspective?
Well, first of all, you know, this weekend is an extraordinary weekend in which not only the G7 is meeting, but the Arab League is meeting in Jeddah, Saudi Arabia. President Xi has convened a group of former republics of the Soviet Union who are together. And so we're really going through, despite the fact that there are some upbeat notes, certainly in the global economy, we're going through a rather extraordinary period in which the geopolitics of the world are changing fairly dramatically, and it all really began with the invasion of Ukraine by Russia. You know, it's interesting, but 10 years ago, we would not be talking about the G7. We would be talking about the G8, and that was the time when Russia was very much a part of that group of nations. But as a result of their having invaded Crimea and taken it over, they were excluded from the group, and so it returned to a G7 status. So we're going through a really fascinating period of time. It's treacherous in some ways. There's certainly some good signs, but we're dealing with other issues like climate change. We're dealing with artificial intelligence. We're dealing with concerns about supply routes. So we really do have our work cut out for us.
You mentioned Russia. You know, in 2014 it was the 8, and then it was back to the 7 again. And you have to think, they talked about sanctions. That's something that's been on the table for a while. They were hoping the sanctions would perhaps pressure President Putin to do more on his end to stop the violence, so to speak. But that certainly hasn't happened. The West is sending, of course, weapons to help support the efforts in Ukraine. And some people are very worried that this could go on much longer than people ever expected.
There's no question about it, including Vladimir Putin himself, who really expected that this war would be over within, or what he refers to as a special military operation, within a matter of days. But I think we should be somewhat realistic that, yes, there have been some ways that Russia has gotten away or gotten around some of these sanctions. The fact is that they really have been squeezed in the energy area. There was quite an analysis that was done that appeared in today's Wall Street Journal in that regard. But Russia certainly is not coming out on top in regards to all this. The very notion, for example, the President Xi has brought together former republics of the Soviet Union who were very close to Russia since the dissolution of the Soviet Union, certainly sends a message that he's trying to certainly corral those countries together, and that takes them a bit out of the orbit of Russia.
There's also been talk about China as well, specifically when it comes to chips. We've talked about it on our show quite a bit. That China accuses America and the West for trying to, I guess, control or maintain or put China in a box. And America says, well, this is really about national security for not just the United States, but for the rest of the Western countries. This debate sounds like it's not going to end anytime soon. Might there be a compromise on the horizon, or is this going to be the status quo?
No, I think this is going to go on for a while. I can remember when I served as U.S. Assistant Secretary of Commerce and was responsible for overseeing U.S. industry. The whole issue of chips was big during that period, but it had nothing to do with China. It had everything to do with Japan. It's interesting because right now there is a need for China and the United States to really sit down and talk. In the aftermath of the United States shooting down that balloon over North America, there obviously has been a bit of a freeze. And of course, we had been expecting Secretary of State Blinken to fly off to Beijing before that happened, and that was called off. Now there is a desire, certainly has been expressed on the part of the administration, to be able to reschedule that meeting, and perhaps even in the aftermath of seeing the President Xi and President Biden get together. But I think talking is going to be extremely important, particularly when it comes to chips, and particularly when it comes to having some, at least a modicum of understanding as to the economic and competitive positions of both the United States and China. For goodness sakes, the world today really runs around both China and the United States. The economies are so large, and everything, whenever those two countries sneeze, the rest of the world catches pneumonia. And we need to be very comfortable in understanding that at the very least there's discussions going on between the leaders of both countries.
James Moore, really appreciate your thoughts on this. You're absolutely right. Two very big countries with a lot at stake, for not just for those two, but for the rest of the world. Thank you.